All right, today we are going to be looking at adding and subtracting mixed numbers, and we are going to use the regrouping method. It's certainly a way to think a little more strategically about how we can add and subtract mixed numbers. The default way that you can always add and subtract mixed numbers that works, that you probably already feel comfortable with, is converting your mixed numbers into improper fractions, but that can honestly lend itself to much more work, more difficult numbers to deal with. So we're going to think a little more strategically and use this idea of regrouping, which we already know and love when we're adding and subtracting decimals and even whole numbers. We're going to use this idea of regrouping, but the only difference is that we're dealing with fractions. So we'll see what ends up happening with that. So remember, mixed numbers are a combination of whole numbers and fractions. So we have our whole number piece and a fraction piece. And recall that combinations and we're talking about addition. Now this is helpful because what it means is that we can break down mixed numbers like 2 1/4, and that's how we pronounce it, 2 and 1/4, as the addition problem, 2 plus 1/4. So really we can separate into our whole piece and our fractional pieces. Now this is helpful for us because by breaking down these numbers, we can go ahead when we're adding and subtracting mixed numbers. We can add our fraction pieces together first and then our whole numbers. So we're going to go ahead and tackle our mixed numbers just like we do with whole numbers and decimals, and we're going to use this idea of regrouping. We're going to use this idea of quote-unquote borrowing, but as you're going to see in a moment, how we borrow the numbers are going to look a little different. So we're going to add and subtract within our place values, or in this case, we're going to add and subtract our fractional parts first, then add and subtract the whole numbers. So we're going to go ahead and start in fraction land and then work our way over into whole number land, just like we do with decimals, where with decimals, we work in decimal land and then we work our way over into whole number land. So we're going to work from the right to left, just like we do with decimals. Now here's the key. I'll go ahead and highlight this. Here's the key. When we're borrowing or regrouping a whole number, when we're dealing with mixed numbers, we are going to rewrite it and borrow it as a fraction. We're going to bring it over as a fraction. So when we're bringing over one whole thing, we have a couple of ways that we can do that. We could bring it over as 10/10, like we do with decimals. We could bring it over as 2/2, 3/3, 4/4, 8/8, 25 25ths. This goes on to infinity. We could bring it over as 1,000 thousandths. The possibilities are endless. There's an infinite amount of ways that we can express one whole thing. So we're going to be strategic when we're adding and subtracting mixed numbers as to how we want to bring that version of 1 over. We have lots of options. So let's do an example together. So we've got 2 4/5. Now adding is a little bit easier than subtracting, as we'll see in a moment. So as I mentioned, we're going to work with our fractional pieces first. Oh, slide that up a little bit. So we're going to add our fractional pieces first. So 4/5 plus 3/5. So that's going to give us a total of 7/5. Okay. Now 7/5 as a mixed number is really one whole thing and 2/5. So we're going to go ahead and take this idea of breaking up our mixed number into a whole number and a fraction, and we're going to separate those two pieces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to regroup, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my one whole thing and regroup it with my other whole things. And then my fractional component is going to go down here underneath my fractions. So really I'm just separating the two components of my number, and I can do that because we're adding these two together. So the 2/5 goes down below. I'm going to regroup the 1. 1 plus 2 plus 1 is 4. And that's our final answer. So let's take a look at subtraction, because subtraction is a little bit tougher. Okay, so we've got 3 1/4 minus 1 3/4. Okay, so I'm going to start in fraction land. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and try and take 3/4 away from 1/4. Now, just like with normal subtraction with decimals and with whole numbers, if the number on top is smaller than the number on the bottom, we use this idea of regrouping. So we're going to go ahead and go next door, and we're going to borrow one whole thing. We're going to borrow one whole thing, because again, this is my ones place value. These are whole things. So I'm going to borrow one whole thing, which will reduce that down to 2 whole things. And now when I bring my one whole thing over, I want to be strategic here. And then when I bring the one over, I'm going to go ahead and drop it down as 4/4. Because, and think about money. If you have $3.25, you could go to the bank and you can exchange that. You can go ahead and say, hey, I'm going to give you a whole dollar. Can you give me back 4/4? Then you would have a total of 5/4. So this problem has now become 2 5/4 minus 1 3/4. Let's start again in our fraction column. So we've got 5/4 minus 3/4. Well, that leaves us with 2/4. 2 minus 1 is 1. And that is equivalent to 1 1/2. And now I'm done.